Good morning. Good morning, Tartu. All right, that's more like it. Excited to be here this morning, my first time in Estonia. As we were talking about before, I'm a storyteller. I love stories. I started telling stories when I was about 14 years old, actually. I got really into Dungeons & Dragons. Anybody play Dungeons & Dragons long time ago? Okay, a couple of hands go up in the air. That's how I kind of got started into stories. But today I'm here to tell you about stories and about the power of stories. But more importantly, I'm also here to tell you about how you as founders can harness the powers of stories to create powerful and successful companies. So I want you to start off by meeting Martin. Martin's 28 years old. He lives in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. He works in a tech company, makes about $60,000 a year. Martin doesn't own a car. He doesn't need to. He rides his bicycle everywhere. And when it's cold outside and it's winter, he takes the metro, or he takes Uber, or he takes Taxify, or whatever he can find. He loves his technology, loves his smartwatch, loves his smart gadgets, loves his smart TV. Everything that's smart, that's him. Really into that stuff. And he's very curious. He's always wanting to try new and exciting new things. He loves to try new and different things that take him out of his comfort zone. But Martin has a problem. That's not a bad slide, by the way. Martin has a problem, and it's called noise. And the problem is this. In 2017, in Europe alone, there was over $115 billion, with a B, spent on advertising. A year later, that number soared to $119 billion. And this year, the forecast is for $121 billion in advertising spend in Europe. The American Marketing Association estimates that on average, American consumers every single day are exposed to 5,000 to 10,000 different brands. Every single day. So how do we reach Martin? How do we talk to him? But the story gets better. Welcome to supermarket land. We walk into a supermarket these days, we don't have choices. I mean, having choice is a good thing, right? We talk about democracy, having choice. Choice is always great. But what happens when you have too much choice? What happens when you're overwhelmed with choice? I'm just out of curiosity, see a show of hands. How many people in this audience in the last 3 months have actually made a conscious choice to buy a different toothpaste? Raise your hands. Okay, probably less than 5%. Okay. How many people in this audience in the last 3 months have made a conscious decision to buy and try a different brand of coffee? Raise your hands. Damn, that's even fewer. You guys are loyal. People love you guys. That's a major problem. We have this overabundance of choice, but we're not making choices. We are overwhelmed with choice. The story gets better. Anybody know what the average attention span of a squirrel is? This is not a trick question. It's about 8 seconds. Now, when he's really focused on his acorn, when he's really focused on his food, it's about 4 minutes. In 2015, Microsoft ran a series of studies and surveys where they found that the average human attention span is less than 8 seconds. So when this guy actually says that he has more attention span than you do, he's not joking. We have so many distractions in our lives. Tablets, smartphones, social media, Instagram, VR, whatever, news, that we don't pay attention. We don't focus. The story gets even better. You can't talk about advertising without talking about trust. And boy, it's been a crazy year for trust when you talk about companies like Facebook, right? Probably a year that they want to forget. Now, when you look at this graphic, there's a couple of things that pop out here. The first is when we look at social media and digital media and search, which is the bread and butter of what most of us as startup entrepreneurs use to connect with users. Well, search has a 60% level of trust, which is pretty decent. But once you go to social media, you're around 42%. And when you go down to mobile advertising and everything else, it just drops off a cliff from there. The mediums that people continue to trust are actually the old-fashioned traditional mediums, which for most of us as startup entrepreneurs are too expensive for us to buy, right? Which creates another problem. So let me summarize for those of you out in the audience who are maybe having your first cup of coffee or didn't catch all the points. As startup entrepreneurs, we are facing an explosive problem in this day and age. Soaring advertising and marketing expenses and costs. More advertising than ever. Lots of noise. A decrease in people's attention spans and their ability to focus. We have more choice than we could ever have possibly imagined, where we're overwhelmed. We spend more time finding a frickin' movie to watch on Netflix than we actually spend watching the movie on Netflix. And then to top it all off, we have a problem with trust. We don't necessarily trust the advertising that we see. So if we want to reach Martin, how do we do that? How do we cut through all the noise? What's he going to listen to? Who does he listen to? Meet Lisa. Lisa is Martin's girlfriend. She also lives in Amsterdam, also rides a bike, occasionally uses a scooter, studies fashion at a nearby university. She loves listening to her occasional book on Audible, once in a while catches a movie or her favorite TV show on Netflix. And she loves her friends and spends a fair amount of time on Instagram doing what? Following up stories, creating her own stories. And we know that Lisa has influence on Martin. Why? Because research tells us, from the likes of Nielsen and others, that 83% of us out there trust the recommendations of who? Our friends and our family. So Martin listens to Lisa. Now, whether Lisa listens to Martin, that's a different question. So if we really want to communicate with consumers in this day and age, we have to look back at history and we have to think, what has been effective throughout history in handing down our values, our teachings, and what society has to tell us? And it goes back 27,000 years ago to the first cave paintings, because that's what we used. We've been using stories for tens of thousands of years to educate our children, to celebrate our heroes and our culture, to celebrate life, and of course, to entertain, right? We all know this guy, the famous web slinger, right? Remember how he became a web slinger? Remember how he got bitten by that radioactive spider and all of a sudden he's got these cool superpowers, right? Stories entertain us. Tonight, after all is said and done and you guys all go off partying, I'm sure you will, and I'm sure I'll see a bunch of you guys out there. You're going to get together with people, you're going to talk about the day's events, and you're going to do what? You're going to talk about stories. And on Friday, when you're in front of your investors, you're going to be doing what? You're going to be selling your company. You're going to be selling a story. And when next week you're interviewing people for your startup and you're trying to get that shit-hot engineer who needs to fix all your screwed-up back end, you're going to be selling that person a story. And a couple weeks after that, when you're working so hard that you forget what day of the week it is and you come home and you realize you missed your anniversary, you better have a really good story for that one. Stories move us. Stories connect with us. They connect with us at many different levels. To further emphasize that, I want to run a little experiment with you guys. Now, everybody in this audience has probably had one of these, and you're probably looking at this right now and your stomach's starting to rumble and you're thinking about the fact that this guy on stage is the only thing standing between me and that sandwich. Where does the word sandwich come from? It's a really cool little story, actually. It started in 1762 with an English lord, Sir Thomas Montagu. Now, Sir Thomas Montagu had a problem. It's actually a pretty good problem to have. He had this problem, which is that he was addicted to playing cards, poker, all sorts of card games, making bets, taking risks. He played so much poker and so much card games that he would kind of like all of a sudden look up and it's 10 o'clock in the evening and he hadn't had anything to eat all day. So he went to his chef, because if you're an earl, that's what you do. You go to your cook. And he said, I got this problem. I keep playing cards. I forget that I have to eat. Can't you do something where you place my favorite meat in something that I can hold in my left hand so that in my right hand I can play cards? And little did he know that Thomas Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, created a tasty treat that bears his name to this day. What happens in our minds and in our brains when we actually are exposed to stories? What's the neuroscience behind it? And just out of curiosity, I kind of decided to look into that for you guys. Well, if you were just listening to the sandwich story, how many of you out there, when you were looking at the sandwich story and hear me talk, actually kind of almost felt some sort of pang of hunger, felt like that sandwich is looking really good right now? Show of hands. Yeah, a couple of people, right? How many other people in this audience right here looked at the cards and said, ooh, cards, money, risk, Vegas, right? How many of you thought about that? Any thoughts around poker? Come on, poker players, don't be embarrassed. Yeah, all right, there's a couple, all right, here and there. But the point is, when we're exposed to these stories, they influence in many different ways. They influence many different emotions. That's what stories do. What's the neuroscience behind this? There's a guy called Giovanni Rodriguez who wrote an article in Forbes a couple of months ago. And the article is called, "This is Your Brain on Stories." So I'll explain real quick how that works. When you're exposed to stories, either you hear a story or you read a story or something, the first thing that happens in your brain is it releases a chemical called cortisol. All right? And what cortisol does is cortisol kind of it pulls attention to the brain. It tells the brain a signal that it's time to focus. It's time to pay attention to what's in front of you. Cortisol, in a word, from a marketing perspective, creates awareness. And awareness, for all you entrepreneurs in the house, is the first step to what? Awareness is the first step in your marketing funnel, top of the funnel. Awareness, that's where it starts. Now the next step, the next thing that's released in your brain is called dopamine. And a lot of you are probably familiar with dopamine. How many people are in the house here to develop video games? Any video games publishers, developers? Got a couple here and there? Okay. When dopamine is released into the brain, well, dopamine is a neurotransmitter that facilitates the transformation of information along neural pathways specific to the reward system in our brain. Right? So when we feel good, it reinforces that message. It sends us this message that, ooh, I feel good. I like this. I want more of that. What does that do to the human body? Creates excitement, creates arousal. It's the next step of your marketing funnel. And the third and then the last thing that's released in your system is called oxytocin. Oxytocin is a chemical, it's a hormone that essentially, it's called the cuddle hormone for a reason. Because basically what oxytocin does is it makes us feel a degree of social bonding, a degree of empathy. So when we see a story that we can relate to, that creates awareness, that arouses us, and we empathize with it, what do we want to do? Well, if we empathize deeply with a story, we want to take action. We see that commercial on television of kids crying or having a really, really bad time or not having any food, and we empathize because we have children, so we want to make that donation. So what do stories do from a marketing point of view? Good stories are like a cocktail, a perfect concoction which releases cortisol, dopamine, and oxytocin. Awareness, arousal, intent, and action. That's how powerful stories are, and that's why people use them. So now I'm going to go into practical end, and I'm going to share with you a story, a couple of stories, as an entrepreneur, and share how these stories impacted our messaging and our success in our company. Back in 2008, I joined a small Lithuanian startup that was one of the world's first app stores. And we had a vision. Our vision was to democratize access to applications. Our vision was to democratize access to mobile apps. Why? Because back in 2008, if you guys remember, if you were trying to get mobile content on your phone, you had to go to Vodafone, you had to go to T-Mobile, Vodafone Live, you had to search for stuff, you couldn't find it, then you had to pay some outrageous price to get downloads on your Nokia N75, and it was a pretty shitty experience. You didn't have universal access to apps. You had to like jump through, barbed wire and like climb over spiked pits to get content on your phone. We wanted to change all that. We wanted to simplify things. We wanted universal access for everybody, regardless of your operating system, regardless of your phone, regardless of your platform, regardless of which telco you're on or where you live. That was our vision. But we didn't have big marketing budgets, so how did we go about doing it? How did we generate awareness? Well, we were an app store, and we actually had a decent amount of traffic because people didn't know where to find apps, so they came to us. And so the more traffic we got, the more data we had. And we turned around with that data, and we started to use that data to do what? To create stories. And we would go to the press, and we would say, here are the top downloads this month by category. Here are the top downloads this month in India. Here are the top downloads this month by handset. Here are the trends of top downloads in Europe versus the United States, or South Africa versus the Middle East. And all of a sudden, we were generating all this news, and we were giving reporters and people in the press all these data points, and we were creating all these stories. And as we created more stories, what started to happen? Well, when people in the press had a question about the app ecosystem or where it was going, they came to us because Apple wasn't giving out any data. God knows they never do. Google wasn't giving out any information. Nokia wasn't giving out any information. So we started to build thought leadership. We used our data to become thought leaders. And as we became thought leaders, what else happened? Well, some of those big companies that wanted to get into the apps ecosystem, they started to come to us because they were seeing us in the news all the time. They were seeing all the data points. And as we did more strategic partnerships with big brands and big companies, that created more stories, which fed the cycle. 2 years later, by 2010, Getjar was named by Time magazine as one of the 10 companies that would change your life. Why? The product wasn't actually honestly that good, but it was all about stories. It was about the vision of democratizing access to content and sharing that data with everybody and getting that message out. But it wasn't always good. They weren't always good stories. Some of them were really tough. On July 8th, 2011, I walked into our conference room at Getjar in our headquarters in San Mateo. And I walked into our conference room, and our entire C-suite was there, our CEO, our CFO, Chief Product Officer. And the room was silent. Everybody was looking down. Nobody said anything. And I walked in, being the marketing guy, the storyteller. I walked in, I was like, what's up, guys? What happened? Did somebody die in here, or what? And our CFO looked across the table. He took this piece of paper, and he pushed it across the table at me. And I picked it up, and I started to read it. And it was a letter from Apple. More specifically, it was a letter from Apple's lawyers. And you know what they were telling us? They were saying, we're sorry, guys. We own the word App Store. You're not allowed to use that in your communication or your marketing ever again, or we will sue you. Now, as an app store, that's kind of a big freaking problem. Wait, we're an app store, but we can't use marketing in our app store? Let me try and figure out how that works again. And so all of a sudden, I understand why the mood was like death in that office room. But there was something wrong with this story. And I kind of smiled, and as a marketing guy, I chuckled because I started thinking about stories. And I was like, this something up here. This sounds cool. This sounds like an opportunity. And our VP of sales, Bill Scott, looked up at me and he's like, what the hell's so goddamn funny, Mork? Why are you always making jokes? This is like serious shit here. And I was like, look, just give me a couple hours. I need a noodle on this thing. But give me a couple hours. I'll figure something out. So I went over to my office, and I spent the next couple hours behind Google, and I did a bunch of research, and I made a bunch of phone calls. And what did I find out? I found out that Apple actually didn't own the trademark App Store. They tried to trademark the trademark App Store a couple of years ago, and they actually had ended up in court with Microsoft, and the judge had blocked it. And I went back to my team, and I made a couple of phone calls to my PR agency and the guys in London and the guys in San Francisco and the guys in New York, and I was like, they just gave us a perfect story. And the story is David versus Goliath. The story is tech titan bullies Silicon Valley startup. And what did we do? We took Apple's letter from their lawyers, we scanned it, and we emailed it to the New York Times, to the Wall Street Journal, to the Washington Post. And what ensued after that, ladies and gentlemen, was a PR clusterfuck of epic proportions for Apple, as you can imagine. Within 2 hours, every single tech blog in the United States had that on their front page. Within 4 hours, the thing had gone global. And by the end of the day, Ilya Loris, our CEO, and myself were on television, on CNBC, talking about being bullied by Apple. We generated more awareness of our company in 24 hours than we had in the previous 24 months, thanks to that. Why? Because it's a great freaking story. People love those kind of stories. People love David versus Goliath. And people hate large companies that abuse their power and beat up on small companies. That was the story. A couple of months later, it was very apparent to me that we were not the only ones that wanted to beat up on Apple. I got a call from a company in Mountain View that had all of a sudden realized that, hey, if we want Android to be really successful, we're going to have to step up our game on content. We're going to have to rebrand Android market and get real serious about content real fast. Andy Rubin, the co-founder of Android, who was at Google by that time, quickly realized this. And I got a call from the recruiters at Google, and they said, hey, we really like what you've done with GetJar. Would you be interested in coming to Google and doing the same for us? And it was a really tough decision, one of the toughest in my life, because I loved what I was doing at GetJar. But I also realized that GetJar had become the ham and Montague sandwich, trapped between a huge slice of bread called Apple on the one hand with a closed ecosystem where we couldn't play, and Google on the other hand with an open ecosystem focused on Android, but that was already pre-installed on every single phone that was going into the market. And it didn't take a rocket scientist for me to figure out that unless GetJar had a radical change of strategy, we were probably not going to be able to live up to our vision. So when Google asked me to join them, and I considered the vision and a new possible story there, it was too good to refuse. Google's story and our vision for content was incredibly compelling because it was no longer just about democratizing access to apps. It was about democratizing access to content, books, movies, TV shows, games, apps, everything. It was a huge freaking story, and I was excited to be part of it. And so I joined Google. We started to build the Google Play marketing team, and we hired Industrial Light and Magic. For those of you who don't know, the team that we hired from Industrial Light and Magic was the actual team that had done the animation of a small blue and white robot in the 1972 movie Star Wars. We hired those guys to produce the first story and the first spot for what would become one of the leading entertainment retail brands in the world. Can we play the video, please?
Google Play uses the power of the web. So you can buy a song on your laptop, and it's instantly available on your phone. Put a book down on your phone, and pick up right where you left off on your e-reader. You can start a movie on your small screen and finish it on your flat screen monitor. And if you buy a game on your desktop, it will get to your tablet before you do. No cables, no syncing, no storage costs. Just pure entertainment, anywhere you want it to be. Because it's all simply here.
Okay. Whoops. Okay. So, but it wasn't just about starting with a great story. Because it's relatively easy to come up with a great video and a great story when you launch your product and get everybody very excited. But the key to creating lasting emotional bonds with users and creating powerful brands that are going to transform your startup into the next Facebook, into the next Google, into the next Instagram is you got to do this stuff repeatedly. You have to come up with great content the way we did at GetJar with our data, and you have to keep putting it out there. Day after day, week after week, month after month, rinse and repeat, A/B test, try your channels, try your messaging. So for us at Google, starting that was just the beginning. We had to find ways to create more great content and more stories, and to continuously push that information out, not just to our users, but to our partners and to our developers. And we created more great stories. We went out and we interviewed app developers, games makers, celebrities, hip-hop stars. We interviewed Steven Spielberg. We put his interview up on the Jumbotron of Times Square. We wanted to celebrate content. We didn't want to be talking about an app store. We didn't want to be talking about retail. Retail's boring. Nobody freaking cares. They care about what they buy in the store. We wanted to create content that celebrated content for what it was like, and to glorify that content for what it was. So let's play this next video. Dragons, baby. Gotta love dragons. How many Game of Thrones fans out there? Game of Thrones fans? All right, that one's for you. Whoops. Let's get practical in the last couple of minutes that we have. The reality is most of us as startup founders don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to create TV commercials or videos. So what I want to do in the last couple of minutes is really get down to the basics of what you can do as founders to create great stories. First, it all starts with the vision. As I talked about with GetJar. As founders, each one of you are storytellers. Each one of you are visionaries. Each one of you sets the pace of your company. It's up to you to develop that vision. But it starts with creating a powerful vision statement of 1 or 2 sentences which defines the essence of your company. And it does 2 things. Number 1, it determines and defines why you do what you do, not how. Nobody gives a shit about how. It's why you do what you do. This is what inspires and motivates people. That's what inspires customers. That's what inspires investors to invest in your company. Second, what do you want to become? What's your vision for the future? Once you have those 2 things down and you start to crystallize that, that creates power. That creates the beginning of your story. Now, it starts with that, but powerful, great stories that inspire people also have one common element oftentimes, which is a big plus if you have it. They have villains. Powerful stories have villains. That's what we connect with emotionally. That's what draws us to us. A good fight. When I was at GetJar and at Google, who was the villain? Apple was the villain. They operated a closed ecosystem. There was no personalization. You couldn't do anything. You were given a set of tools, that's what you did. Was it profitable? Yes, maybe. Okay, great. But you had a sandbox, that's what you played in. They were our villain. And we used that to galvanize and inspire our troops. Great villains make great stories. The next thing you do, content marketing. In the same way as I was talking about with GetJar, with what we did with our data, some of you may be able to do that as well with your data. Think of how you get your data out there and how you create powerful content marketing. To create powerful content marketing, you need to think about a couple of things. First, who's my audience? And it's not men and women 18 to 35 years old. Way too broad. You got to narrow it down. Really think about who you want to talk to. Second, what's your message? What are you telling that audience? Why should they care? Third, how are you getting that message out? What are your tools that you use to communicate that story? And there are a lot more of them than you think, and some of them are free. Fourth, how do you repeat that message time and over again? Learning is repetition. And lastly, you've got to really think about how you communicate all that great content that you make. If you're creating powerful blog posts, entertaining podcasts, infographics, using data, how do you actually get it out there? How are you using email? How are you using SEO? How are you working with other bloggers to get backlinks to your blog so that more people come to your site? How are you using press and your contacts and your business partners to actually get that content out there? You can come up with the best blog post in the world, but if nobody sees it and nobody reads it, it's useless. You need to get your content out there. You should spend as much time distributing your content as you do creating it. In summary, I'm a cyclist. I cycle a lot. And one thing I've learned is when you're doing Gran Fondos, it's not about how fast you're pedaling. It's about keeping going. It's about persistence and staying the course, particularly with content, particularly with marketing. It takes time. You have to build frequency, and you have to do it over and over and over. So 5 last points when it comes to this. First, develop a clear, concise, and powerful vision. Preferably back that up with a meaningful villain that inspires your people, inspires your customers. Second, have great content that educates, inspires, entertains, and is shareable. Fourth, have a smart, consistent strategy to getting your content out there. And leverage any means necessary to make sure you get a wide enough appeal and high enough frequency. And last, you're going to need a lot of patience and persistence to make that happen. And that's kind of about it. Oh yeah, one last thing. A very famous and very successful tech entrepreneur once said, the most powerful person in the world is the storyteller. So stay calm, develop your vision, and go out and create meaningful, powerful fucking stories. Thank you.